the envelope had been sitting on the dashboard of Callum Bryce's truck for 11 days. He hadn't opened it. He knew what was inside, the final notice from the power company, third one this month, and knowing was enough. Opening it would make it real in a different way, the kind of real that required action he wasn't sure he could take yet. He pulled into the parking lot behind the Lakeshore Clinic just as the first snow of November started coming down. Not the pretty kind, the wet, heavy kind that sticks to your windshield and doesn't come off clean. He sat for a moment with the engine running, watching it pile up on the hood of the truck, and then he turned it off and got out. Callum was 41. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something better, weathered and honest, the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun up on job sites, not from laughing, though he used to laugh more. He was a framing carpenter by trade, and a good one, but the project he'd been counting on since August had been pushed back twice, and now the foreman was saying maybe spring. Maybe. His daughter Faye was 9. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which Callum tried to be grateful for even on the days it nearly broke him. Her mother, Andrea, had been gone 3 years now, not dead, just gone. A distinction that Faye seemed to understand better than most adults in their lives did. Gone to Vancouver with someone from her office. Gone in the way people go when they've decided that the life they were living wasn't the one they wanted. Callum had spent a long time being angry about that. He was mostly done with the anger now. Mostly. He'd brought Faye to the clinic for her flu shot, which she had been negotiating against since Monday. The deal they'd landed on was a flu shot in exchange for pancakes at the diner on Hollister Street, the one with the real maple syrup and the vinyl booths, not the fake stuff. Faye had driven a hard bargain. It was quiet in the waiting room, which was unlike her. She sat beside him with her coat still on and her mittens in her lap and stared at the fish tank in the corner like it owed her something. "It doesn't hurt," Callum said, for the 4th time that week. "You've never had it," she said, also for the 4th time. "I have, actually." She looked at him sideways. "When?" "When I was around your age." "Did it hurt?" He thought about lying. He didn't, a little, for about 1 second. She turned back to the fish tank. He could see her doing the math, weighing 1 second of pain against the pancakes, against the satisfaction of having held out this long, against the very real possibility that she might get the flu in January and miss 2 weeks of school, which she'd claimed she wouldn't mind but which he knew she would, because Faye didn't actually like missing things. She just liked reserving the right to. "Fine," she said. That was that. The wallet was on the floor near the front desk. He almost missed it. A slim leather billfold, dark brown, half kicked under the edge of the reception counter. He noticed it on his way back from the water fountain while Faye was with the nurse. He stood there for a moment looking at it, and then he picked it up. It wasn't just a wallet. He could feel before he even opened it that it was too heavy to be empty. He stepped to the side, away from the main foot traffic, and opened it carefully. The cash was folded into 2 tight bands, hundreds, mostly. He didn't count it right there, but he could see it was significant. There was a driver's license behind a clear plastic window, a woman, dark hair, mid-30s maybe. Serious expression the way everyone looks serious in license photos. The name said Nadia Farron. There were a few business cards, a health card, a bank card, a folded receipt from somewhere. He stood with the wallet in his hand and looked at the cash again. He thought about the power bill on his dashboard. He thought about the conversation he'd had with his landlord last week, the one where Gerald had said he understood, completely understood, but that he also had his own expenses. And Callum had nodded and said, "Of course, Gerald, of course." He thought about the job that might come back in spring, might. The word that had started to feel like a threat disguised as a promise. He thought about all of that. And then he walked to the front desk and handed the wallet to the receptionist and said he'd found it on the floor by the counter. The woman behind the desk looked at him with a kind of mild surprise like she'd expected him to do something else with it. "Do you want to leave your name?" she said. "No," Callum said. And then, because he wasn't trying to be dramatic about it, "She'll just want her things back." He went back to wait for Faye. Nadia Farron was not having a good morning. She'd been at the clinic since 7:30 for an early appointment, part of the occupational health assessment required for the project she was managing. A federally funded community health initiative that had, in the last 6 weeks, become something she thought about when she was trying to fall asleep, when she was driving, when she was in the shower. Not in the way a person thinks about something they love. In the way a person thinks about a problem that doesn't resolve. She was a program auditor. She'd been doing this work for 9 years, first for a private firm and then, for the last 4, for a federal oversight office based out of Ottawa, though she worked remotely from Keswick now, which was a small enough city that she still found it surprising when she ran into people she knew at the grocery store. She'd moved here after her divorce, not running, exactly, but not staying, either. She was 37. She had the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, which she'd stopped trying to correct. She wasn't cold. She was careful. There was a difference, and she'd learned not to explain it. The thing about the project. The Northern Hearth Initiative, a name she'd privately started calling the problem, was that the numbers didn't match, not by a little. By enough that she'd had to go back 3 times to make sure she wasn't misreading the reports. Funds allocated for community outreach had been redirected. Not obviously, not in the way that showed up clean in an audit. In the way that required you to follow the paper across 4 separate accounts and 2 subsidiary vendors, and then sit with what you'd found and understand what it meant, before you decided what to do next. What she'd found meant that someone, more than one, someone had been pulling money out of a program designed to fund health services in rural and remote communities and routing it somewhere else. Not a little money. She had not yet determined exactly how much, but the working figure in her mind was somewhere around $80,000. She'd been sitting on this for 2 weeks. She hadn't told her supervisor yet. She told herself it was because she needed to be sure, and that was true, but it was also true that she was afraid of what happened next. She'd seen what happened next before. The meetings. The careful language from people above her. The way a finding could be softened and delayed, and eventually filed somewhere that no one looked. She left the clinic at 9:15, and it was only when she got to her car and reached for her wallet to pay the parking meter that she realized it was gone. She went very still. She thought back through her morning, the waiting room, the front desk, the water fountain. She must have dropped it. She turned around and went back inside, and the woman at the reception desk said yes, someone had turned it in. Everything should still be there. "Who turned it in?" Nadia said. "A man," the receptionist said. "He didn't leave his name." Nadia stood at the desk with the wallet in her hands and opened it. The cash was there. The cards were there. Everything was there, which should not have surprised her. The person who'd found it had turned it in. Obviously, they hadn't taken anything. But it did surprise her, in the tired way that small kindnesses sometimes surprised her now. "He didn't leave a name," she said again. "He said you'd just want your things back." She left, and sat in her car in the parking lot for a while. Longer than was probably reasonable. The snow was still coming down. She watched a man come out of the clinic with a young girl. 9, maybe 10, dark-eyed and serious, wearing a red jacket with a broken zipper held together with a safety pin. The man was tall, carpenter's hands. The kind of jacket you wear when you're not worried about looking like you're wearing the right jacket. She didn't know why she kept watching them. The girl said something, and the man laughed. A real laugh, sudden and brief. And then they walked to a truck at the far end of the lot, an old F-150, with something sitting on the dashboard she couldn't make out from this distance. She thought, that's probably him. She didn't do anything about it. She started her car and drove back to her apartment on Clement Street and sat down at her kitchen table, with her laptop and opened the file that she'd been living inside of for 2 weeks. But she thought about it on and off for the rest of that day and into the next. The pancakes were good. Faye ate 2 full plates and then sat back with the particular satisfaction of someone who has collected on a debt, which, in a sense, she had. Callum drank his coffee and listened to her talk about a book she was reading, something about a girl who discovers a door in her grandmother's house that leads somewhere else. He'd lost the thread of the plot somewhere around the 2nd chapter, but Faye didn't require him to have read it, only to listen. "Do you think doors actually go places?" she asked. "Doors go places by definition. You know what I mean." He did. "No," he said, "but I think that's why people like reading about it." She considered this with genuine seriousness. He watched her. The way she held her fork, even when she wasn't using it, the way she looked out the window between thoughts like she was checking something against the outside world, and felt, as he did, sometimes, the particular weight of raising a person. Not a burden. Something heavier than that, and better. He thought about the wallet again that evening, after Faye was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread out in front of him. Not to look at them, he already knew what they said, but because leaving them in the drawer felt worse than looking at them, and he thought about what it would have felt like to take the money. He'd thought about it. He wasn't going to pretend he hadn't. He'd stood in that clinic lobby with enough cash in his hand to cover the power bill and the rent and maybe 2 months of groceries, and he'd thought about it for several seconds that felt longer than several seconds. And then he'd handed it in. Not because he was a good person, or not only because of that. Because he knew what it felt like to lose something and not be able to get it back. Because whoever had dropped that wallet was going to spend the next few hours retracing their morning in a cold sweat, and he could end that, and so he did. He put the bills back in the drawer and went to bed. Nadia found him through the clinic. She hadn't planned to. She'd gone back 2 days later to drop off a donation to their community fund, a thing she did sometimes when she owed something she couldn't identify, and she'd mentioned to the receptionist that she'd wanted to thank the man who'd returned her wallet. The receptionist, who was not technically supposed to give out information about patients, had said that she remembered the little girl had been called in as Faye Bryce. And she'd said it in a tone that made clear she felt this information could be released in good conscience, which Nadia appreciated. Faye Bryce in the school registry, Callum Bryce listed as primary guardian. She wasn't going to do anything with it. That was what she told herself for 4 days. It was a strange thing to track someone down just to say thank you for not doing something wrong, which was its own uncomfortable thought. Crouched, on the 5th day she drove to the address she'd found. A small rental house on Birch Gravel Road, the kind of neighborhood that looked like it had been planning to improve for a long time. And she sat outside for a few minutes and felt ridiculous, and then she got out of the car anyway. He came to the door in a work shirt, and she could see from his face that he was trying to figure out how he knew her. "I don't think you do," she said. "Know me. I'm Nadia Farron. You turned in my wallet at the Lakeshore Clinic last week." He looked at her for a moment. "You tracked me down. I wanted to thank you." "You really didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "That's not quite why I'm here." She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing, which was unlike her. She was methodical by training and by nature. She made decisions after weighing them, not before. But she'd been sitting with the problem for 17 days now, and she hadn't told anyone, and the not telling was starting to feel like its own form of doing something wrong. And there was something about a man who stood in a clinic lobby with a wallet full of cash and handed it in without leaving his name. Something about that specific kind of person that made her think he might be someone she could say a thing out loud to without it being used against her. She told him she worked in federal program oversight. She told him she'd found something she wasn't sure what to do with. She didn't tell him specifics. Not yet. She just said, "There's a program that was supposed to help people in rural communities access health services, and money from that program appears to have gone somewhere it shouldn't have." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear a television somewhere in the house. Children's programming, the cheerful kind. "How much money?" he said. "Still determining that. Possibly 80,000. Another silence. "And you haven't reported it?" "Not yet." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because I've reported things before and watched them get buried. Because the person who'd receive my report is the same person whose department oversees 2 of the accounts I'm looking at. Because I don't know yet who else is involved." She paused. "And because I'm a little afraid of what happens to me if I get this wrong." He nodded slowly. Not the performative nod of someone waiting for their turn to talk. He was actually taking it in. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I think I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't involved." He got up and made 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one, and she realized she did. His name was Callum, and over the next 3 weeks, she kept finding reasons to come back to Birch Gravel Road. She told herself this was because she was working through something difficult, and it helped to have someone to think alongside. Which was true. He was good at listening, in the specific way that meant he was actually thinking about what she'd said, not just waiting, and sometimes he'd ask a question that reframed something she'd been looking at from the same angle for too long. He had a directness about him that she hadn't known she needed. She also told herself that Faye made it comfortable to be there. The girl had accepted Nadia's presence in the house with a pragmatic equanimity that made it feel somehow officially sanctioned. The second time Nadia came by, Faye had appeared at the top of the stairs and said simply, "Are you staying for dinner?" and then disappeared again before Nadia could answer. She stayed for dinner. What she was building in those 3 weeks was a case. Not the kind that required a lawyer, not yet, but the kind that required the right documentation assembled in the right sequence so that when she did go forward, there was no room for it to be softened or rerouted. She was building something that would have to be answered, not filed. The money had been redirected in 4 stages. The first redirection was in August of the previous year, flagged internally as an emergency vendor payment. Callum's question: if a foundation withdraws 80,000 over 4 transactions and calls each one an emergency, what's the first thing you'd check? Had pointed her toward the vendor records, which she should have pulled earlier but hadn't. Because the vendor existed on paper, and that had seemed like enough. It wasn't enough. The vendor had been incorporated 4 months before the first payment and dissolved 8 months after the last. The person who had signed off on the emergency authorizations was a regional director named Stanton. The person who had approved Stanton's signing authority was in the oversight office. Not her supervisor. 1 level above her supervisor. She sat with this information for 48 hours before she called someone she trusted at the Auditor General's office. A woman she'd worked with 7 years ago, briefly, who was careful and thorough and had no connection to this file. The call took 20 minutes. By the end of it, she had a path forward that didn't run through the compromised channel. She drove to Birch Gravel Road afterward, not because she needed to tell him anything. She just drove there. Faye opened the door before Nadia could knock. "He's in the back," Faye said. "He's fixing the step." The back step had been broken for, it turned out, 2 months. Callum was crouched over it with a drill, and he looked up when she came around the side of the house. "You look like something happened," he said. "I made the call," she said. He set down the drill. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of someone who understood what it cost to do a thing you'd been afraid to do. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like I've been holding something very heavy and I just put it down." She paused. "And now I don't know what to do with my hands." He smiled at that. A real one, the kind she'd seen briefly in the clinic parking lot, the one she'd been thinking about more than was probably appropriate since then. Faye had materialized in the doorway behind her without making any sound. "Are you staying for dinner?" she said, the same as before, with the same inflection, as if she were asking a very simple question with a very obvious answer. The investigation that followed was neither fast nor dramatic. It rarely is. Stanton was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks of Nadia's disclosure. The vendor records were subpoenaed. The oversight officer who had granted Stanton signing authority had retired the previous year, which complicated things in ways that frustrated Nadia deeply, and which the investigator assigned to the file assured her were normal, though she didn't find them normal. Crouched. 3 months later, the formal findings were published. 2 individuals had been involved in the redirection, Stanton and a program coordinator whose name Nadia hadn't expected. The money had been partially recovered. Stanton faced charges. The Northern Hearth Initiative was restructured under new oversight, which meant the communities it was meant to serve would eventually get what they'd been promised. Eventually was not a satisfying word, but it was something. In February, the framing project came through. Not maybe spring. Actually February, which was early, and Callum took it and worked 6 weeks of long days in the cold, and when it was done he paid Gerald in full and put the power bill envelope, still unopened, in the recycling, which felt better than he'd expected. Nadia had stayed in Keswick. She'd been offered a position in Ottawa after the investigation concluded. The kind of offer that comes attached to the understanding that you did something right, and she'd thought about it for a week and then turned it down. She wasn't finished with the work she was doing here. She wasn't finished with other things either, though she was slower to name that. It was March when she finally let herself think clearly about what had been accumulating since November. She was sitting at Callum's kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made herself because she knew where everything was now, and Faye was at the other end of the table, doing homework with the focused frown she got when she was working on fractions, and the particular ordinary piece of that moment made something settle in Nadia that had been unsettled for a long time. Callum came in from outside and saw her at the table and didn't say anything. He poured himself a coffee and sat down across from her and opened a hardware catalog, the kind with dog-eared pages and handwritten notes in the margins. They sat like that for a while, Faye's pencil scratched against paper. Outside the window, the last of the snow was letting go. At some point, Nadia reached across the table and set her hand on his. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a conclusion. It was just a small decision made quietly, without any guarantee, which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of decision that was ever actually real. He turned his hand under hers and held it. Faye looked up from her fractions, looked at them both, and looked back down again, with the expression of someone who has known something for a while and is content to have been right. I keep thinking about the envelope on that dashboard. 11 days, unopened. Not because Callum didn't know what was inside. He knew exactly what was inside, but because some things are easier to carry when you haven't fully named them yet. That detail has stayed with me more than almost anything else in this story. Because I think most of us have an envelope like that somewhere, a conversation we're postponing, a decision we're holding at arm's length. And the question Callum's story quietly asks is, what kind of person are you when you're holding something heavy and no one is watching? He stood in that clinic lobby with enough cash to change his immediate situation, and he handed it in anyway. No one would have known. There was no camera on him, no audience, no reward waiting on the other side of the right choice. Just a man alone with a decision and the kind of integrity that doesn't require witnesses. That's the thing about real character, it doesn't perform, it just acts and then moves on. And Nadia, I think about what it cost her to sit on what she'd found for 17 days. People sometimes misread that kind of stillness as cowardice, but I don't think it was. She was being careful in the way that people are careful when they've been burned before. when they've done the right thing and watched it get quietly neutralized by the people who had more to lose from the truth than from the lie. Her hesitation wasn't weakness. It was intelligence earned the hard way. She needed to be certain. She needed to build something that couldn't be unmade. What I find myself returning to is how both of them were operating from the same underlying understanding, that doing something right without a guaranteed outcome is the only version of doing something right that actually counts. Callum didn't return that wallet because he knew Nadia would track him down and something good would come of it. He returned it because it was the right thing to do, full stop. Nadia didn't finally make that call because she was sure she'd be protected. She made it because the cost of not making it had become something she couldn't live with. There's a kind of quiet courage in that, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that makes a good speech, but the kind that shows up in small rooms and ordinary Tuesday mornings and does what needs to be done without asking for credit. Faye knew something too, in the way that children sometimes know things before the adults have finished figuring them out. She looked at the two of them at that kitchen table and went back to her fractions, content. I think about that a lot. What it means to raise a child who watches you make decisions, not just the big visible ones, but the everyday ones, the ones when you're tired and it would be easier to look away. Those are the ones that teach. Those are the ones that last. The envelope got recycled in February. Unopened. That's the ending I keep coming back to. Not the hand-holding, not the investigation resolved, though both of those matter. It's the envelope in the recycling bin, and what it meant that he didn't need to open it anymore. Some debts get paid, not always on time and not always the way you expected, but they get paid.